Welcome Khayriyyah Muhammad Smith on the workshop called How to Source Podcast Guests Intentionally.
Hi, and welcome to my session on sourcing podcast guests intentionally for Africa Podcast Day 2022. I'm really excited to introduce myself. My name is Khayriyyah Muhammad Smith, and I'm a podcast host, and I host a podcast called Bring Your Own Chair. In my day job, I work in global health philanthropy with a focus on maternal and newborn health and adolescent girls' sexual reproductive health. I love listening to podcasts, and about 5 years ago, I noticed that so many of the podcasts that I listened to, especially mainstream popular podcasts, didn't feature women of color as experts or guests very often. It made me reflect on my own life and reality and how I'm never really asked to share my perspective or share my knowledge and expertise. And I wanted to create a space for women of color to be able to do just that. So that's where the idea for Bring Your Own Chair came about. Young women of color are habitually not offered a seat at the table. And this podcast allows us to create a space where we get to bring our own chair. We get to serve as the experts of our own stories and share our voices with the world. Each episode of Bring Your Own Chair features a conversation with a young woman of color, where she shares her background, interests, goals, and expertise. Since Bring Your Own Chair's debut in 2018, I've had the pleasure of interviewing over 20 young women of color from all across the world and hosted a panel on behalf of the podcast, which focused on the experience of young Black women in the nonprofit and philanthropy sectors. So essentially, every episode of my podcast is an interview episode, and that means I spend a lot of time sourcing guests. So I'm really excited to be able to share today with you guys what I've learned so far, tips and tricks, and all those kinds of things. So let's jump in. Today, we're going to talk about finding a podcast guest and just what that process kind of looks like as I've experienced it. So first, we'll chat through episode structure and when it might be the best time to invite a guest on your podcast. We'll talk about how to source guests, planning to record with them, and the logistics of recording with guests. So first up, when to invite a podcast guest. In my experience, there's kind of three main scenarios where you might want to have a podcast guest on. And some podcasts are even have featured formats as interviews, just like mine. So if your podcast is an interview podcast, then you'll be bringing on guests for each episode. And I spend a lot of time sourcing guests for each season. The next scenario that you might come across is if your podcast features different topics or current events, it could be nice to have someone with subject matter expertise to weigh in on your discussion. So say 1 week we're talking climate change, the next week we're talking crypto or maternal newborn health. You might want to have someone on who's versed in those subject areas to be able to have a really knowledgeable and kind of genuine conversation about those. And then lastly, if your podcast is structured as a solo venture, it can be nice to change up the format and invite a guest on for a live dialogue or conversation just to switch up the format. And now we'll jump into how to source podcast guests. So the three main ways that I've kind of used are as follows. First, there's looking in your own network. It can be easiest to look within your own network as a place to start for potential guests since you're already connected to this realm of people. Another tactic that I use is starting a referral system. This can be a good way to find guests, especially ones that your listeners are connected to or would like to hear from. And then lastly, there's making cold call requests. Sometimes you want to invite a guest on your podcast that you might not be connected to at all, and we'll talk about the best ways to shoot your shot there. So first up, starting with your own network can be a great place to start for guests, especially when you might be first starting out your podcast. I know for myself, when I started mine, I was kind of like, who am I going to start to interview? Like, where am I going to look? And it was really easy to start to pick from my network, especially since the podcast was featuring young women of color. As a young Black woman, I had a lot of my peers, in professional networks, friends, acquaintances that I could pull from. And they really showed up for me when I first started my podcast and was able to have some amazing conversations with young women who I was already connected to and got to learn more about them and really allowed them to have the space to kind of share their knowledge and expertise with, my podcast audience. That was a great place to start. And depending on the subject matter of your podcast, your network might provide a lot of potential guests. So depending on what you want a guest to contribute, starting with friends, colleagues, or acquaintances can make for a slightly more comfortable ask. However, it's important to remember that just because you're connected to someone doesn't mean that they'll automatically agree to come on your podcast, because who knows of what they do, how they have to operate within their work. A podcast isn't the greatest fit for everybody to come on and kind of share their perspective or their knowledge. So it's really important to remember to make a genuine ask and explain to them why they are a good fit for the podcast outside of just being connected to. So almost in the same way, that you might approach someone that you don't know, it's important to put the same kind of energy and effort behind an ask to someone who you do. The next tactic that I have used and continue to use to this day is starting a referral system. This has allowed me to make sure that I'm bringing on guests that I know that my listeners or people who have heard of the podcast, want to actually hear from. And so the way that this kind of works is you just need to provide a space or a platform for people to make referrals. This could be if your podcast has a website and you can embed a contact form, or even a simple Google form can be used to intake this information from people who are aware of the podcast or people who listen and say, hey, I know so-and-so, I think they would be great to come on the podcast to talk about X, Y, and Z. Here's the best way to contact them. Another kind of approach within the referral system that I use is when I have guests come on the podcast after, we've recorded and they've gotten the experience, I really love to ask them, is there anyone that they know who they would, like to refer to have on the podcast? And that can just be a really great connection point, and it allows you to reach outside of your close network and expand it to that next level, so that when people are referred to you, you can approach that person, even though you might not know them, and say, hey, so-and-so who's been a previous guest on the podcast, or so-and-so who listens to the podcast recommends that you would be a good guest to bring on. And that can kind of bridge the gap between you not knowing them. And it's always lovely to know that someone thought of you and referred you for an opportunity like this. And then lastly, we've got the cold call requests, or as I like to call it, shooting your podcast shot. So I've spent a lot of time reaching out to potential guests who I'm not directly connected to, and it has made for some amazing connections and episodes, and it does actually work. I think that it's really important for my podcast, Bring Your Own Chair, for us to be able to hear from diverse women with diverse interests, hobbies, and professional backgrounds. So it's really important for me to reach outside of my network and connect with women, who work in different spaces, do different things, just so that the podcast has a breadth of experiences. And so that means I'm doing a lot of kind of cold call outreaches. And it can be daunting, but it's also really fun. And when the connection is there, it's just such a great experience. So finding potential guests, I've been able to find guests on Twitter or Instagram hashtag searches. I've been in work webinars and connected with people in small groups, and that connection has grown to come outside of that work webinar. And I've had guests, come on the podcast from that area of my life, and then referrals from other people. So yeah, it's just kind of any space that you might inhabit or work from. If you find someone, see someone who you find interesting, it's always worth it to kind of think about how they might serve your podcast and consider making an ask. And when doing that, especially when you're not connected to the person, I think that it's really important to do your research. So first of all, it's important to do your research on the guest and their work, and really think about why they would be a good fit for that episode, so that your ask can be clear and intentional about why you want them to come on the podcast. Additionally, if, like my podcast, I speak to women of color who have far reaching, interests and things that are not personally within my wheelhouse. So I think it's also really important to do a little bit of background research, especially if you're having a guest on whose expertise isn't yours, to be able to know a little bit more about the subject matter and their perspective and how it might be fitting into a larger conversation. I think that allows for you to make a much more informed ask, just within the context of why you want them to come on. And then it also makes you a much better host, and it allows you to have better conversation and dialogue now that you have, done a bit of research about how their work might fit into the larger scheme of things. And then lastly, it's really important to reach out to these contacts if you're going to do it, with no kind of prior connection, to do it logistically, so that your message and your ask can have the best chance of being noticed. So if the person that you're asking is really active on a social media platform, you could try to send DM there. That's definitely worked for me in the past. I've DM'd people on Twitter and Instagram, and they've been guests on the podcast. If that person, doesn't really spend a lot of time on social media, but they do have a website and a contact form, that could be the best place for you to make that ask. And if the person has been referred to you, or, you find an email for their agent, an email, that they have set up personally for requests, then it's probably best for you to shoot your shot there. So really just think about, the person that you're asking to come on, the context of their work, and like where you have seen them do most of their communications. And that can probably be the best place that you want to send your ask to make sure that it gets noticed. And so say, you've found this potential guest, you have connected with them, you are, planning to record with them. There are a few kind of like tips that I have learned to help make this process go a lot smoother than not. So the first one, again, is to be really explicit with your ask. So once you've connected with them, you really want to make sure that you've been clear about what you would like your guests to contribute and what your recording process looks like. I like to create what I call a recording guide for my guests so that they know what we intend to talk about in advance, what questions they'll be asked, etc. And I think that this is really helpful so that guests can come to the recording session prepared and aware of what's going to be happening, what they will be asked. Of course, through conversation, we can deviate from questions, expand on things, but they at least have an outline or a guide that they can look at in advance and just feel prepared coming into the recording session. Next, I think it's really important to remember that asking someone to be on your podcast should be a mutually beneficial experience. This should be, the podcast getting to benefit from their expertise and knowledge, and them also being able to benefit in some way from being on too. And so I really like to try to build the episode as collaboratively as possible while still serving the podcast interest, but making sure that the guest feels like if there's anything about their work specifically that they'd like to highlight, especially if, they've got an article or book or, ad or product that's coming out soon, to make sure that we highlight that in the episode. How do they want their bio to look or to be read out or depicted, in the show note or in the live episode, or, asking them what images do they want to be used on the podcast social media, I think is really important. And the way that the episode is built can be a collaborative experience that both you and the guest can feel ownership over. And I think that just makes for an overall just more inclusive experience. And then that guest really feels some ownership over that. So when the episode comes out, they're really proud of the product, they want to share with their networks, etc. And then lastly, you're going to want to review recording logistics ahead of time. So in this virtual world, I know that we're online so much, but that doesn't mean that our tech is always foolproof. So you want to make sure that your guests have whatever they need to record ahead of time. So I do all of my interviews via Zoom, given the pandemic that we're in, and also interviewing guests, from across the world and not being able to meet face to face. And so ahead of time, that's just reminding guests, hey, for this amount of time, you're going to want to have a quiet space. You're going to need headphones with a microphone. Here's the Zoom link well in advance, just making sure that they are technologically prepared going into that recording session. And I also like to build in, about 10 minutes into the recording time, just to make sure that we can do any tech checks and make sure everything is sounding correctly. We have everything that we need. Things are working on both ends before we start to record, to make sure everything is comfortable and is going to go as smoothly as possible. And here is an example of the recording guide that I was just speaking about. So I make one of these for each guest that comes on my podcast, and I share it with them in advance just so they can see this is their bio, this is how it's going to be read on the show, and this is how it's going to be presented in the show note, and then any corresponding social media links that they want to share as it relates to their work or how to connect with them. So this just shows them what is going to be read aloud and shared, and it also gives them an opportunity in advance to make any edits or just update this so that I make sure that I'm sharing their bio in the way that they want it to be shared. And then I also send them a list of questions that, we are going to, that are going to help guide our conversation. And again, we might deviate from these and, as the conversation develops organically, but I think that it's really important and really helpful to just share questions or an outline guide of the conversation in advance, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And again, this gives your guest an opportunity to make any edits or, point out things about their work that they want to highlight. And it also just allows them, time to prepare and think about these ideas in advance so that when we get on and we're recording, there's the jitters, might not be as high, and they've kind of thought through some of these ideas so that they can make sure, they're answering in the ways that they want to as well and depicting their work in the way that they would like to. So thank you so much for tuning in. That feels like so much information in such a short time, but I really hope that it was helpful, and I'm wishing you all the best luck on your podcasting journeys. I would love to stay connected, so feel free to reach out to me on social media. Happy to chat about my experience thus far and learn. I think that this has definitely been a learning process for myself, and I'm always open to connecting with other podcasters, to improve or, just kind of share ideas and throw them around. So please don't hesitate to connect. And just want to close out with a huge thank you to the Africa Podfest team for this knowledge sharing platform that they have given us and the opportunity for me and Bring Your Own Chair to participate in Africa Podcast Day 2022. Thank you so much.